Good evening, and welcome back to 13 Horror Nights. It's episode 11, and tonight's movie is 10 Cloverfield Lane. I have seen Cloverfield a long time ago, but from what I can tell, these movies aren't really, strictly sequels to each other. They seem to just sort of take place in the same world. From what I can tell, 10 Cloverfield Lane is closer to a thriller than a true horror movie than a lot of the other movies that I've watched this month. And the plot is that apparently there's this big apocalyptic thing happening outside, but you don't know, you're just in this bunker with these three people, a woman and two men. One of them is played by John Goodman. And I'm pretty sure John Goodman had a big role in a sitcom back in the day, but I'll always just know him as the voice of Sully and Pacha. And he seems to play the villain in this movie, which John Goodman does not have a villain persona to me at all, but I've heard so much praise for his performance in 10 Cloverfield Lane. The original Cloverfield was basically a found footage version of Godzilla, but this one is both third person, like most movies, and more of a thriller, where the woman, the main character, is torn between the idea of there actually being a huge apocalypse outside and John Goodman's character just being crazy and wanting to keep her locked inside this bunker forever. It's almost like Schrodinger's cat, except we're in the box. Much like The Autopsy of Jane Doe from yesterday, this movie appears to take place almost exclusively in one setting and has a very small cast of characters, which means you need to have both a compelling setting and a good set of characters to make it work. I honestly don't really know what to expect. This seems like a very simple plot, but this movie has gotten so much praise, I'm interested to see what it has in store. I'll go watch it, and I'll get back to you guys with my review. Okay, I finished watching 10 Cloverfield Lane, and I thought it was pretty good. I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. I do think I prefer the first Cloverfield, but honestly, I don't really think it's fair to compare these two movies, considering that they essentially have nothing to do with each other. This movie was originally a script for something else that wasn't meant to be a sequel or even a spiritual successor to Cloverfield, but they decided to change that. And it kind of shows. But anyway, I digress. I am not exactly sure how I feel about John Goodman's role as the villain in this movie. I think it gets the job done, but it's so different than how I normally see John Goodman. Especially, there's a point in the movie where he shaves and he suddenly just looks like your dad, basically. And he will always have that voice of, Sully and Pacha, so that's a little weird. But I do think that he does make this work. I kind of wonder how this came about, this isn't something I would ever, imagine happening organically. It just seems weird. But I think an even better performance in this movie was of the lead, Michelle, by Mary Elizabeth Winstead. She does very good in this movie. She's a character that you want to see make it through this. This movie is kind of like if you combined the anime Danganronpa and Misery, considering it's a combination of both being held hostage by someone who is also saying they're taking care of you and saving your life, and also being sealed in a space with a giant apocalypse outside that you're not even sure you want to go out into, even if it means escaping. For me, I think that the most striking thing about this movie is, the moments of comedy in it. Most of it is very serious. It's not, a horror comedy in any way, but this is the way it is with a lot of J.J. Abrams movies. It was like that with The Force Awakens. It was like that with the original Cloverfields, and it was like that here. There are a few actually funny moments in this, otherwise very grim movie. I'm pretty sure what they were going for with John Goodman as Howard, his name is that it was kind of like Kathy Bates in Misery, where they seem like such a normal person, but the more you learn about them, the more just insane they sound. But instead of the person being a hyperfan of the person in question, this one is a conspiracy nut, like an ex-military, doesn't trust anything, thinks aliens are gonna invade or whatever. But I'm sorry, I just don't love John Goodman as this role. He clearly is putting his all into it. I'm not saying he gave a bad performance, but just in concept, it doesn't work nearly as well as it did in Misery. But what makes up for that is actually the interactions between the other two characters, Emmett and Michelle. They work off each other very well. They form a genuine friendship with each other, and I liked seeing the two of them interact with each other and eventually plan their escape. I'm starting to think that the Cloverfield franchise was what they decided to just try to see if they could just actually simulate what would happen if the apocalypse happened, how people would react. And yeah, you got in the first movie where it's just abject panic, total chaos, anarchy, lawlessness, people are dying left and right. And then you have this in 10 Cloverfield Lane where you got the conspiracy nuts who are finally validated and are given a hero complex. There are definitely some problems with this movie. Mainly, I think the pacing. The way that this movie is structured didn't really vibe very well with me, and the climax took forever, but I can't really talk about that in detail until we get to the spoilers. Whether or not you liked the original Cloverfield is kind of irrelevant as to whether or not you'll like this one. They weren't originally meant to be like in the same series, but on its own, I think it is a good movie. It's not spectacular. I think the same idea has been done in other things better, Misery, Danganronpa, but for what it is, I thought it was pretty good. Now let's start talking about the spoilers. It starts out with Michelle being 100% convinced that Howard is completely insane. There is no apocalypse happening outside. He's just insane and is riding on his delusions of grandeur. But when she makes an escape, she is actually, conveniently, someone runs up to the door of the shelter and starts begging to be let in, but she has like nuclear burns all over her face, and she looks like she's about to die. And that's what eventually convinces Michelle that this is happening. So she just sort of accepts that they are going to be stuck in this bunker for a long time. Then there's a scene of them, trying to live their life, playing games, doing puzzles. There actually is a funny scene later in the movie where it's like catchphrase or one of those games where you're trying to guess something that someone else is trying to explain. But Howard was like saying, it's like, I know what you're doing. I know that you've been bad. I'm always watching. I see you when you sleep. And they were planning their escape at that point, so they were both freaking out. But then Michelle said, "You're Santa," and they was like, "Yep." So that was funny. That was probably the funniest moment in the movie. Much like in both Misery and Don't Breathe, they discover that, aside from just being crazy, they also have a couple murders under their belt. And there was a kidnapped girl who disappeared, and they found evidence that she was kidnapped by Howard and locked in the cellar. That's when they try to plan their escape. They use a shower curtain to make like a hazmat suit. They make their own gas mask. It's lucky that Howard had so many books about surviving the apocalypse in his bunker. But then they slip up and get caught. Emmett takes the fall for it, and Howard just shoots him on sight and dumps his body into acid. Though it was kind of inconsistent because later, like, when she was making her true escape, she, like, knocked over the bucket of acid and, like, Howard fell in it. And I was expecting him to just, like, die right from that because they definitely made sure to state that this will dissolve through skin, no problem. But you actually see him, like, right after, and he doesn't look that bad. So then she escapes, and then the twist of the movie, there's like 5 twists actually. The first one is that the air outside is safe. It's not like nuclear fallout, you'll get burns just by being out in it. But there is still an alien apocalypse happening. You see UFOs, and yeah, these aliens look nothing like the Cloverfield monster. Again, they really didn't do that good of a job of making these sound like they're actually part of the same universe. But honestly, I did kind of have a problem with the climax of this movie because it lasted like the entire third act was this one ongoing crisis. It's just one bad thing after another. You think she's gonna die, she's not. You think she's gonna die, she's not. And eventually you're just sitting there, it's like, okay, what's gonna happen next? What's next? What is the next twist? So another thing that was revealed, and I think that this was the plot of the Andromeda Strain, an old movie, but they were basically like spraying humans like bugs to kill them because they had this like green gas that came out of the UFOs, and Michelle was able to get her hazmat suit on time, and that must have been what happened to the lady who was pounding on the door earlier in the movie. And she manages to escape in a car, and she drives, and on the radio they hear that there are other survivors. They say they've taken control of the southern seaboard, I believe, so there are more survivors. They're fighting back. I don't understand how this connects to Cloverfield. We've gone from one monster falling in New York City to an alien invasion of the entire world. But she lamented earlier in the movie that she wished that she could help people in need more than she did because she was abused as a child, and she felt empathy towards people who are just being abused or in pain. And she hears on the radio that they need people with medical service in Houston, and there's like a fork in the road, Baton Rouge or Houston, and she turns and goes to Houston, and that's when the movie ends. I think that this movie would have fared better if they didn't try to make it a sequel to a movie that it's clearly not a sequel to, because a lot of the stuff that was wrong with the climax, like the constant twists, like the weird things. Oh, I should mention this. I have complained about bad CGI, but I will say the CGI in this movie is very good. The aliens in this movie look so much better than the aliens in A Quiet Place, but I digress. It's just like the things that they did connect these two movies together ended up kind of dragging the movie down. And I kind of wish it was like Danganronpa, where like the whole thing was just getting out and then you have no idea what happens once they actually open the door and go out into the world. But even despite that, I can safely say there were more moments in 10 Cloverfield Lane that worked than ones that didn't. It's not a great movie, but a good one. Alright, I'll see you guys tomorrow.